Welcome to the first in a new series of Desert Chorale Conversations. I'm Yuvar Maradi, the marketing and box office manager for the Chorale. And you've probably spoken to me on the phone at some point or run into me at a concert selling tickets by the door. But my guest today is Joshua Habermann. He'll need no introduction because you see him practically every concert, conducting beautiful music for you and introducing a lot of great new composers and pieces of music. So Josh, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So one of the things I most admire about you is that you can really bring new composers to people, and you're good at introducing, these new works that aren't as familiar. But I think you yourself are not as well known to a lot of Desert Chorale patrons as you could be. Can you introduce us to yourself a bit more and tell us how you got started in music and kind of when you knew that it was going to take over your life professionally?
Sure. So I definitely was interested in music from a young age, as a lot of kids are. But I know that my mom's teachers reported back, or my teachers reported back to my mom that I loved music and danced very enthusiastically in the music classes and that sort of thing. And so there was certainly an interest at a young age, but I was also interested in other things. I was fascinated with languages and with diplomacy and international travel, and I really did for a long time think that's where I was headed, well into even high school and college. But there was an experience that I would describe. I was probably in my senior year in college, and I lived off campus at that time. So I was riding my bike to campus, and it was East Coast. I grew up in California on the West Coast, so I was unfamiliar with winter, and I didn't like it one bit. And I was very grumpy when I had to go through the slush and the snow, and especially on my bike. And so I'd put a Walkman on. I don't know if your audience actually knows what Walkman were back in the 1980s, but they were these devices that we listened to music on. So they had headphones, and I was listening to a cassette tape, also a somewhat antiquated technology. And it was the Strauss Four Last Songs that I had on cassette. And as I look back on it now and I think, well, if you were a college senior and you were listening to the Strauss Four Last Songs, there's a possibility that you were going into music. We can kind of see that now. But at the time, I didn't think so, and I was just listening to it, and I listened to it a bunch of times, but I was grumpy because of the winter. And I managed to pedal so quickly to get myself to campus that I was about 15, 20 minutes earlier than I needed to be for class. So I sat down outside the room, and at this time, of course, there was no mobile phones or no way to distract yourself when you're waiting, and so I just sat. And as I sat, I began to listen to the music that had been playing the entire time when I was on my way to campus. And I began to hear it for the first time in a way that, even though I had been listening to it and had listened to it dozens of times before, I had never heard it in that way as I did in that moment. And it's not choral music. It's a piece for a soprano and orchestra that's incredibly beautiful. And it's poetry of some great German poets, including Hermann Hesse, who I was reading at the time, like a lot of young people do in their late teens and early 20s. Mm-hmm. And it had a lot to say to me. And I guess what I could describe as sort of a feeling of epiphany, or a feeling of realization that this thing that music was so much bigger than I had previously realized. And that it was bigger than Richard Strauss, and bigger than Hermann Hesse, and bigger than me, and bigger than everything I'd imagined. And there was something that really called me to it. And it's a little neater to tie it up in a bow now than it was in the moment. My feelings were sort of less coherent about it. But I just knew that there was something that was so personally attractive and so important and so compelling in that moment. And it was from then on that I really sought to shift gears, because I had been studying languages and I expected probably to work in the Foreign Service or in some international capacity. And at that point, I really thought, well, maybe no, it's this other thing. And then how am I going to do that? And how do I match my skills and talents with that ambition? And then it led me down a different path.
Now, at that point, were you already a singer? Just on the side or anything?
Yeah, and a little bit. So I had sung as a kid and loved it. I remembered being in my eighth grade musical, and my voice had not changed yet in eighth grade.
Mhm.
So I remember getting to sing. I went to a boys' school. So in
What
our
was the
musicals, there
musical?
were very few girls in
Oh,
our elementary school. We had to import the like one or two girls that you could get. And I felt very special because I got the part in the play where you got to sing the duet with the girl,
ah.
but my voice had not changed, and I had the high note at the end and she didn't. So I felt pretty special about that. So I definitely remember singing, even as a grade school kid.
Mhm.
But as happens, my voice changed, and for boys, it's really like relearning to walk. It's a huge change, and that's at the same time that physically I was getting bigger and a little bit stronger, and I got interested in sports, and that became something that I was doing more of. And then it took me well into high school before a buddy of mine got me back, and he was into choir, and he said, "Look, you love this stuff. I know you do. Why don't you come back to it?" And I said, "Oh, okay, I'll give it a try." And got back to singing at that point. So I was singing in high school and in college, but not in the same way that, our Desert Chorale folks who've been training since they were little and were just phenomenal, private voice students all that time. I would not say that was me at all. That was something that I came to a little bit later.
And was singing what you first wanted to do professionally with music, or did you
Uh,
have other ideas, as soon as you heard and started getting serious about music after the four last songs, what were you thinking of doing in your life with music
yeah, I
at that
didn't
point?
know. Yeah, I definitely didn't know, but for sure it had something to do with vocal music because I love music and I love words.
Mhm.
And so I had been studying piano a little bit. I was self-taught on the piano because I just decided I was going to learn in high school, and so I did. And was, getting more serious about it and taking lessons and that sort of thing. So I had thought about piano, but I certainly wasn't talented enough, first of all, to do it professionally. And second of all, I didn't have the drive to do instrumental music in the same way that vocal music attracted me. And I think that has everything to do with words.
Mhm.
I love poetry. I love literature. And that's one thing that I really don't regret about having studied other things besides music.
Mhm.
Being so involved in languages and in particular poetry and literature and novels and just all of that, I've always been very sensitive to the marrying of great words with great music. And so for me, that was vocal music and not solo vocal music because that wasn't either my talent or my ambition. But choir certainly fit the bill.
Mhm.
And I had been teaching since I was young. I had always felt comfortable in front of groups of people. Leading groups to a common purpose felt very natural to me and appealing. I remember in high school, I convinced the Spanish teacher to let me, as a junior and senior, teach the freshman Spanish classes from time to time, and she
Oh,
would
wow.
critique me and help me, get better. So being in front of groups was always something that I wanted to do. And when it came to being in front of groups and choral music, and then all of a sudden it became pretty clear that maybe choir directing was the thing.
And at what point did you kind of make that transition? What was that like? Were you singing in a choir and then you transitioned to leading it?
Yeah, so this was in college. I sang in a collegiate a cappella group, which I really enjoyed. And because the school I went to didn't have music majors, I was fortunate. I went to Georgetown University, which is a great school that offers no music major.
Mhm.
And so me, with my fairly limited training, was sort of the one-eyed man in the kingdom of the blind.
Mhm.
In that a lot of opportunities flowed my way when they were looking for a pianist to play for shows, or they were looking for somebody who could do arrangements for a cappella groups. I could do those things. I wasn't, had I gone to a school that was really had some qualified music majors, I wouldn't have had those opportunities because they would have had actually qualified people. Instead, they had me. And so I benefited from that because I got a lot of experience just getting thrown in with pop music and with playing the piano for shows and for trying to lead a cappella groups and things like that. So that transition happened kind of naturally over the last couple of years of college.
Mhm.
And then it was a question of some private study. And so I went to teachers. There were just two music professors at Georgetown at the time total. And I went to them in my last couple of years and I said, look, I think I'm interested in doing this other thing, but I'm going to finish out my degree in languages and then I want to do this other thing. And they said, okay, we'll teach you. And they were wonderful. They taught me privately, sort of the equivalent of a music major,
Mhm.
kind of doing it independently on my own time. and they were incredibly generous and great teachers. Their names were Philip Taka and Miho Houlihan, and I'm in touch with them to this day. They're still teaching, not at Georgetown, but elsewhere, and I'm grateful to them for the opportunities they gave me and the training they gave me, which led me then to go to Hungary to go study at a little conducting program for which I was, again, unqualified but enthusiastic, and managed to wiggle my way in there. And then from there, it led to some opportunities back in my hometown in San Francisco. I picked up some work teaching high school, not music, but languages, but on the side, singing in the symphony chorus in San Francisco, and then studying music theory and music history and all the rest, until I felt like I was ready to go back to grad school. And then that led me down a path that led to choral conducting.
So how did you get into this program in Hungary based on not even having a degree in music? They were convinced by some of your teachers, or how did you make that leap?
Yeah, I think it was partly other people's kindness. You know, my teachers recommending me and saying, look, this guy looks unqualified, but he might not be terrible. You know, just give him a chance.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was also pretty, I don't want to say insistent, but I was enthusiastic. I was relentlessly enthusiastic. So I got over there for a summer program, and they said, look, you just go stand in the corner and watch everybody who knows what they're doing, and maybe you'll pick something up, and that'll be the end of it. But by the second or third day, I was already singing, and then at the piano, and then pretty soon I was up in front, and I had some opportunities there that maybe I didn't deserve, but they were kind enough to offer to me. So I think it was a little bit of enthusiasm and a little bit of relentlessness that got me there.
Was this your first time at length in a foreign country, or had you been out of the States before?
No, I had. That was something that just seemed to be part of my character since I was little. My mother tells a story that when I turned 5, which is the age of my son now, she asked me what I wanted for my birthday, and I told her in all seriousness, I said, an atlas and a passport. And to her credit, she got me an atlas and a passport. And I wasn't going anywhere, you know, it was just in my mind that I could. Mm-hmm. And I was always fascinated by travel and the idea of other places and faraway places and going there and speaking languages. So that's something that as soon as I could, which is really about 9th grade, I was able to start arranging experiences for myself through exchanges and where you go live with a family abroad. And I did a series of those over the course of summers in Chile and South America, and then in Spain and in Sweden. And then my freshman year of college, I didn't get into the schools I wanted to go to. I was rejected from just about all of them. So instead of going to the one that I thought I was kind of lukewarm on, I pulled the plug and went abroad for a year and studied in Switzerland and then came back. So I did a lot of international living, including some in Asia. After college, I went and taught English over there. So that's always been in my blood. But that experience in Hungary was unique in the sense that the teachers were really serious. The Hungarians take their music training very seriously. Mm-hmm. And so they really pushed us hard. And I liked that because I was hungry for it, especially having been at a school where there wasn't music training. So I liked that environment, and it benefited me, and I'm still grateful to those folks.
So did you particularly seek out Hungary as a place to go, or was it, you know, just the opportunity that turned up, kind of?
It was particularly related to these two teachers. They were both trained in Kodály method, which Kodály was a Hungarian music educator and composer. And so when they recommended, you know, you go to your teachers and you say, what should I do next? And they said, you should go to the summer program in Hungary. And I said, Hungary, great, let's go. But there was no particular personal connection to the place. And the language turned out to be pretty inscrutable. It's a very difficult language. I didn't get very
far European, is it?
It's not. It's
tricky.
It's an isolate language that doesn't relate to anything else. Mm-hmm. I became functionally illiterate at a kindergarten level after a couple of weeks. I was not effective in learning that.
But you made do with the universal language of music, I guess.
Yes, that was what we fell back on for sure.
So having kind of spent that time in Hungary, do you feel a special affinity with Hungarian composers or maybe the culture in general?
I wouldn't say that, only because I was just there for a summer program, so it wasn't a long time. and it wasn't enough for me to develop a deep understanding of the culture, the language, or anything like that. But a soft spot for music of Kodai for sure, because we got put through a lot of it. And an understanding of teaching music. Yeah, he has a lot of choral music actually. It's a lot of it is accompanied in orchestral music it's not a natural fit for the Desert Chorale.
Right.
But there are some a cappella pieces that are beautiful and that we've done. So yeah, I really do like it.
Excellent. I noticed that you also have a special affinity. You mentioned Sweden, but you wrote a dissertation on Rautavaara, who's a Finnish composer and actually one of my favorites. So I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, you're going deep. That's not too many people have asked me about my dissertation, but yes, it's on Rautavaara, Finnish composer, who I loved. And actually, I became interested in him because of that time in Hungary. When I arrived there, there was a Finnish choir that was performing. The Finns and the Hungarians have some cultural affinity, and so they have a lot of exchange back and forth. And so there's a Finnish choir that had come to Hungary to be at that summer program, and they were singing this music that I loved. And it was on Lorca poetry in Spanish. And I had finished my degree in languages, and particularly in Spanish. So it was a poem that I knew very well, and they were singing it. And I thought, this is the weirdest thing. It's a Finnish choir in Hungary singing in Spanish, and I'm an American listening to it all. So I just became fascinated by that. And that led me down the rabbit hole to Rautavaara, who's this great composer from Finland, who recently died just a few years ago.
I know. Until he passed away, he was my favorite living composer.
Nice.
I was really sad about that.
Yeah, well, he lived a good...
It's not like he had retired. He was still turning out great works,
Yeah, in the 80s and 80s plus.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's it was great fun to do that research, and I have no illusions about my dissertation changing the world, and that's what I tell students who are going through their doctoral programs, sweating out their dissertations, and I say, work hard on it, but realize that one book that you write isn't necessarily going to change the universe. So take it with a grain of salt, and I do with my own stuff. But it did lead me to a fascination with Nordic music in particular.
Mm-hmm.
I did live in Sweden for a time and do speak Swedish, and so for me that's been a big part of my work with Desert Chorale, is bringing Nordic music, which I really love, music from Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, because those countries have an incredible choral culture that isn't long. It really started only about 50, 60 years ago in earnest, and I'm particularly drawn to it. So I do love that, and I do feel like I'm getting a chance to use some of that research and put it into practice.
What culture would you say you feel the strongest affinity with in terms of choral music or musically in general? Is it Nordic music? Is it South American music? Is it?
No, it's American music, because I'm an American and through, and as fascinated as I am with music from abroad, and I am fascinated by it, in particular Nordic music and then Latin American music, and you mentioned that is a particular interest of mine that I just love and is important for our work in Santa Fe, and we do a lot of it.
And it's part of American music as well.
Absolutely, and I've always embraced, because of my studies in Spanish and in Portuguese, I've always embraced that idea that the Americas extend from the top of Canada all the way down to the tip of Argentina, and we are all Americans. And so that idea of New World music is really interesting to me. But using the word in the sense that we use it here in the US, I would say I'm an American through and through. And I'm most drawn to our own music, because I think that we have a responsibility, as each person does in their own culture, to represent people who are speaking through that culture and lift them up. And so when we tend to commission at the Desert Chorale, we tend to commission American composers for that reason, because we're one of the leading American chamber choirs. And we do American music, and particularly music from the United States, regularly as part of, our staple diet, because that is the music that speaks most directly to our audiences. And I want people to love choral music as much as I do. I feel like that's my job. And having music that speaks in their own language, in a familiar, vernacular, way of communicating, eliminates all the barriers that otherwise exist. And I think that's really important.
The wonderful thing is that America is such a melting pot. You still get a great deal of variety. Not that other countries don't have them as much, but but for example, we had commissioned an American composer, Rena Esmail, for the upcoming East Meets West concert, and she has a lot of other influences in her music, right? So you can say we are commissioning an American composer, and it's not the same as if you were saying we're commissioning a Finnish composer. Perhaps you really don't know exactly what you're going to end up with in terms of a sound or a style necessarily.
That's absolutely right, and that's the beauty of the United States. There was an old Schoolhouse Rock that was a program that was on in the 70s when I was a kid to teach kids about it and teach kids about the Great American Melting Pot, and that is us. And so we can go to somebody like you said, Rena Esmail, who has South Asian background, born in the U.S., grown up in the U.S., but a strong affinity for Indian music and classical Indian music. We can, I think about just our recording in 2017, The Road Home. It was all American music, but wildly different. And it went from shaker tunes, simple unison melodies, all the way through somebody like Sidney Guillaume, who's an American composer born in Haiti and writes in Haitian Creole because that's part of his own language. That's the way that he communicates most naturally. But he's an American just the same as you and I. So, so that painting with an American brush gives us a lot of different colors.
So Josh, what would you like to impart to people who are just starting out in music? What did you learn from your own journeys early on getting into professional music?
Well, the path that I took is unusual in the sense that, a more typical path would be somebody who studied an instrument or singing from a very young age and went through a music education program, that sort of thing. And I didn't do any of those things. So the first thing that I would say is there are a lot of different paths that you can follow. And you follow your passion and see where it leads and see how it intersects with your talents and your motivation and all of that. But the one constant that I would say that seems to move through all of my experiences is the idea of saying yes. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I had graduated college and I remember coming back. I went abroad and was an English teacher in Thailand, nothing to do with music, just wanted to have that experience. And then I came home and I was working in a hotel. It was a pretty unglamorous job and involved a lot of flipping mattresses and filling vending machines and doing things like that. But on the side, I was getting ready for grad school in music. And so I went to the San Francisco Public Library and checked out every choral orchestral work that I could find and studied them at night. And then I went to a concert at the San Francisco Symphony. It was the symphony chorus singing, and I went with a buddy, and they were wonderful. And at the end, he pointed to the program and he said, "Hey, look, there's an announcement here that the symphony chorus is having auditions. You should audition for them." And I said, I could never sing in a group this good. And I meant it, that was my honest feeling. And he looked at me and said, "Why not?" And I thought about it. He said, "Why don't you just go do an audition?" And I thought, okay, yes. And it was a week later that I stood in front of the director and I, stumbled through whatever audition piece I had, and he was nice enough to let me in. And from that point forward, I had these incredible experiences through San Francisco Symphony and got to sing for all these conductors, and then, got a little bit more training. And when the director he asked me at one of the rehearsals, he said, "I understand you speak Spanish." And I said, "Yeah, it's true." And he said, "We're doing a program coming up that requires Spanish language coaching. Can you do it?" And I said, yes. And what that led to was him taking me out to dinner to say thank you. And he asked, as part of that dinner, he knew me as a Spanish teacher, a high school Spanish teacher who just liked to sing. And he said, "So what do you want to do when you grow up?" And I said, "Actually, I want to do what you do." And he was very surprised. He didn't know that. And so from that point forward, he looked out for me. That was my conductor in San Francisco, Vance George, who's still alive, and I'm still in touch with. And for the next 15 years together, he looked out for me while I sang in that group, and he gave me opportunities, and he put things in my path, and he had me sing when Robert Shaw came to town, and I got to sing for him, and I, just in the choir. But it was formative, and it was all because I had said yes. You know, I remember it was a couple years later when I was getting ready to go to grad school, and the guy I was studying with at the San Francisco Conservatory at the time said, hey, do you know about this thing ACDA? And I said, no, what's that? And he said, the American Choral Directors Association, ACDA. They have these national conventions, all these choir people go, and if you want to be a choir director, you should go check it out. And I said, where is it? And he said, it's in San Antonio. And if you go, you should go see my friend, Craig, who teaches at the University of Texas, because he's got a great program and you might like to study with it. And I'd never been to Texas. I didn't know anything about Texas. San Antonio might have been the other side of the moon. But I said, yes. I said, okay, let's go see. And I ended up coming down and seeing ACDA, and it was amazing, and watched Craig work, and he became my teacher. I ended up going to school there because he offered me a scholarship, and I said yes again. And I don't mean to imply that saying yes always, you know, leads to doors that open to, you know, wealth and fame, because none of that is true necessarily.
They can saying no.
Yeah, sometimes saying no is good too. Absolutely. But, you know, sometimes the yes leads you to places that you didn't ever imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been the case for me. And I feel very grateful to have gotten into music and have music blessed as part of my life. I also try to keep perspective and to know that it's not my whole life. You know, that I have to have a life outside of my profession, and that's my personal life. And I have a family and a wife and 2 kids who are important and a big piece of it. But of course, I married a musician, so she's very understanding. And I feel very grateful. So to get back, you know, to your first question of what would you say to people, I would say follow your passion and say yes to as many things as you can handle well. And then also remember that there are other aspects of your life too that are important, that have to live in balance with your professional pursuits.
It seems interestingly like your non-musical passions from earlier in life lead you back to music in some ways, like your studying Spanish led to this opportunity. You don't know what's going to lead to the next opportunity.
Yeah.
And you ending up in Thailand, you've gone back there, as I understand it, as well, to do music related work.
Yeah,
right?
it's
So
true.
you never know what's going to lead to something else, even if they're not obviously connected.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what I did always was following passions, following things that I was excited about.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't say that, you know, learning Swedish has led to fame and fortune. It hasn't. But it has led to some great friendships.
Mm-hmm.
And it's led to leading tour groups over there to perform. And it's led to getting to know some incredible music that I never otherwise would have known.
And introducing that music to other people as well.
And sharing that music with other people. That's right. And sharing the thing that I love with other people in the hopes that they'll love it too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the idea. And that's the concept behind, you know, the Desert Chorale concerts. I try and talk a little bit at them, and I try to be careful so that it doesn't become a lecture. But that we also do our best to break down the barriers, whether they're barriers of language or cultural barriers that might otherwise be hard for people to say, well, what does this Swedish folk song have to do with me? And I say, it's about loss. It's about longing. And all of us have experienced that. And then it might just open a window. It might just open a door that somebody could walk through to experience a Swedish song in the same way that they might experience Amazing Grace, with the same immediacy. So that's my life's work. And I feel incredibly lucky to be able to pursue it, and pursue it with one of America's greatest chamber choirs.
Thank you so much for your time, Josh. I think your early non-musical interests and experience have really made you a great ambassador for music as well. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today, and I look forward to future conversations with you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much.